We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The sound of the radio was the only thing that greeted Deputy Samuel Rhodes when he stepped into the farmhouse on County Road 214. It was tuned to a local AM station out of Lubbock, broadcasting static between country songs and livestock market reports. The clock on the wall read 9:52 p.m., and the second hand had stopped mid-tick, frozen in place as if time itself had been interrupted. Outside, the late October wind carried dust across the flat Texas plains, rattling loose tin sheets on the barn roof and scattering tumbleweeds across the driveway. Inside, everything was still, except for that low murmur of the radio that had been playing for hours before someone finally called for help. The call came from a field supervisor at Lone Star Petroleum who'd gone to check on one of his pump operators, 51-year-old Daniel Webb, after he failed to report for his night shift. Webb had never missed a shift in 22 years, not even during storms or holidays. When his supervisor, Jerry Kinney, arrived, he found the farmhouse locked from the inside, every window bolted, curtains drawn. The pickup Daniel used for work sat parked out front, keys in the ignition, driver's door closed but unlocked. The porch light glowed steadily, and through the lace curtains Kinney could see the flickering light of a television left on mute. He'd knocked for 10 minutes before driving to the nearest gas station to call the sheriff's office. Rhodes arrived just after 10:30 p.m., accompanied by his rookie partner, Deputy Carla Mendoza. Both deputies immediately noticed the lack of disturbance around the property. No broken glass, no footprints other than Kinney's fresh ones in the dirt, no sign of forced entry. The screen door creaked when Rhodes tested it, its hinges squealing in the dry wind. The main door was bolted from the inside. They called out Daniel's name several times before Rhodes decided to force entry. He kicked the door at the handle once, hard enough to splinter the frame, and the sound echoed across the empty fields. What they found inside would become the defining mystery of Lubbock County for the next 18 years. The farmhouse was neat, almost obsessively so. The kitchen counters gleamed, dishes washed and stacked. A half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs sat on the table, beside an open newspaper folded to the business section. The coffee in the pot had gone cold hours ago. Daniel Webb's work jacket hung by the back door. His watch sat on the counter beside a small pile of coins and a half-smoked pack of Marlboros. The only thing missing from the orderly scene was Daniel himself. The back door was secured with a steel slide bolt, engaged fully. The windows were locked from the inside, and the only footprints leading to or from the house were Rhodes and Kinney's. The deputies conducted a full sweep of the premises. Bedroom, bed made, no signs of struggle. Bathroom, towel damp, mirror fogged slightly as if someone had showered earlier that evening. Living room, television frozen on a paused VHS tape of Walker, Texas Ranger, with the player's digital clock blinking 8:21. In the hallway, Rhodes found Daniel's boots lined up neatly beneath a wooden bench, toes facing outward, laces tied. His wallet sat on the nightstand beside the bed, containing $84 in cash and his driver's license. No signs of violence, no missing items, no reason for a man to simply vanish from a locked house in the middle of nowhere. When the forensic team arrived shortly after midnight, they confirmed what Rhodes already knew. Every entry point had been secured from the inside. There were no foreign fingerprints, no forced locks, no disturbed dust layers on the windowsills. Only one anomaly stood out. In the corner of the kitchen, the small battery-powered transistor radio continued to hum faintly, its antenna bent, its dial fixed on 620 AM. It was later determined that the radio had been broadcasting live weather updates for a thunderstorm that never reached Lubbock that night. The last full transmission captured on a cassette recording from the station's archives occurred at exactly 8:23 p.m., the same minute that Daniel's VCR had frozen. The county medical examiner, Dr. Eugene Parks, arrived at 1:40 a.m. expecting a body, not a ghost story. His initial examination of the farmhouse found no evidence of foul play, medical emergency, or animal intrusion. There was dust on every surface except the chair where Daniel had presumably been sitting to eat his eggs. That chair was clean, recently wiped, and pulled slightly away from the table. On the table, next to the cold eggs, was a folded note that no one noticed until daylight. Written in neat block letters were 5 words. "It's already under the pump." That cryptic message would become the cornerstone of every conspiracy theory surrounding Daniel Webb's disappearance. Oilfield workers speculated it referred to one of the pump jacks he maintained, possibly indicating an accident or buried equipment. But when investigators searched all 27 sites assigned to Webb's maintenance route, they found nothing unusual. No disturbed soil, no damaged machinery, no traces of a human body. Webb's disappearance became an obsession for Sheriff Alan Briscoe, a career lawman known for his steady temper and old-fashioned methods. He'd been elected 3 times without opposition and prided himself on knowing every family in the county. The idea that a man could vanish from a locked house under his watch gnawed at him. Briscoe personally interviewed every coworker, neighbor, and family member. Daniel's ex-wife, Karen Webb, told investigators that Daniel was a creature of habit, early riser, meticulous with schedules, sometimes superstitious about numbers. He believed clocks stopping at the moment of death were signs of the spirit world crossing over, a belief he'd inherited from his grandmother. Their divorce had been amicable, finalized in 1998 after 23 years of marriage. Karen said Daniel had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to disappear. His only child, Caleb Webb, then 21, was attending Texas Tech in Lubbock. He told deputies his father had recently complained about strange noises near the oil field during night shifts, describing them as metal groans or deep vibrations coming from beneath the ground. Caleb dismissed them as normal mechanical sounds until his father mentioned seeing light patterns in the dirt, as if someone had buried electrical cables that glowed faintly after dark. Investigators documented the account, but found no physical evidence to support it. Over the following weeks, search teams combed the surrounding fields and dry creek beds. Helicopters scanned the area with thermal imaging. Dogs tracked faint scent trails that led in circles before vanishing entirely near the property line. By November 12, 2001, Sheriff Briscoe reluctantly reclassified the case as missing person under suspicious circumstances. The farmhouse was sealed, evidence tagged, and the community returned to its uneasy normal. But the story refused to fade. Radio hosts discussed it as the locked house mystery. Conspiracy websites claimed alien abduction or secret government experiments. Others pointed to corporate foul play, suggesting Daniel had discovered something on company property that Lone Star Petroleum wanted buried. Those theories gained traction when, 6 months later, an anonymous envelope arrived at the sheriff's office. Inside was a copy of an internal shift log from Lone Star Petroleum dated October 27, 2001, the night Daniel vanished. The log listed every active pump site in District 14, along with operator initials and maintenance codes. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary, except for one discrepancy. Pump Site 7B, located 30 miles west of the Webb farmhouse, was marked as operational even though it had been decommissioned in 1996. Someone had manually added the site back into rotation for that one night. Sheriff Briscoe drove out to 7B personally. The site sat abandoned, its rusting pump jack motionless against the horizon, the surrounding land overgrown with mesquite and Johnson grass. Yet beneath the weeds, faint tire tracks suggested recent activity. In the dirt near the pump base, Briscoe found a piece of torn canvas with Daniel Webb's initials stitched into the hem. The discovery reignited the investigation. Over the next months, forensic teams excavated around the decommissioned site, uncovering buried equipment that hadn't been logged in company records. Among the debris were sections of corrugated steel pipe and a set of reinforced concrete panels arranged like a crude vault. When the panels were lifted, they revealed an underground chamber about 6 feet deep and 10 feet across, filled with sand and oil residue. Inside that chamber, investigators found 2 items that would define the rest of the case: Daniel Webb's wristwatch, frozen at 8:21, and a portable cassette recorder containing 15 minutes of audio that began with the same radio broadcast playing in the farmhouse. The recording captured Daniel's voice muttering indistinctly about numbers not matching and shifts off the books, followed by a metallic clanging sound and a low, rhythmic vibration. The tape ended abruptly with a single word whispered close to the microphone: pressure. The recording was sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety's audio lab in Austin for analysis. Technicians confirmed that the background sounds matched the harmonic frequencies produced by oil pumps operating under irregular pressure loads. In layman's terms, Daniel had likely discovered that one of the supposedly inactive wells was still producing, illegally siphoning crude oil through underground lines connected to active leases. Lone Star Petroleum denied any knowledge, citing possible vandalism or unauthorized operations by former employees. But when the company's regional compliance officer, Thomas Reeve, abruptly resigned 2 weeks later and left the state, suspicion deepened. Sheriff Briscoe attempted to track him down but met bureaucratic resistance from the company's lawyers. Meanwhile, Daniel's family remained in limbo. No body, no closure, only fragments of evidence that seemed to point in multiple directions. By the time the one-year anniversary of his disappearance arrived, the farmhouse had become a local landmark for curiosity seekers and amateur sleuths. People claimed to hear faint radio music when standing on the porch at night, even though the power had long been cut. A deputy assigned to guard the site during a storm in 2002 swore he saw the porch light flicker on by itself at exactly 8:21 p.m. He quit the force the next day. The official investigation ground to a halt by 2003. Sheriff Briscoe retired the following spring, handing his successor, Captain Mark Delaney, a box labeled Webb. Daniel, unresolved. For the next 18 years, the file gathered dust in the evidence locker beneath the courthouse, waiting for the one discovery that would finally make sense of the impossible. That discovery would come not from a detective or forensic specialist, but from an audit clerk at Lone Star Petroleum who, in 2019, stumbled across a set of forgotten shift logs buried in a data archive labeled Maintenance Surplus. Those logs, handwritten in fading ink, listed Daniel Webb's name under multiple dates after his recorded disappearance. And next to his name, in neat cursive, was a single phrase that would change everything. Approved by TR. Deputy Carla Mendoza could still remember the morning the new evidence came in. She had been a rookie the night Daniel Webb disappeared, and by 2019 she was the senior investigator for the Lubbock County Sheriff's Cold Case Division, a department that existed mostly on paper. Most days she handled lost property reports and updated files for grant compliance, but when the Lone Star Petroleum audit clerk forwarded those shift logs, her name was copied by accident. Mendoza almost deleted the email. Instead, curiosity made her open the scanned pages. The handwriting on the maintenance surplus sheets was unmistakably human, blue ink looping in careful cursive. The top page read October 30th, 2001, 3 days after Webb vanished. Daniel's name appeared in the night shift operator column. Signed off with the initials TR, Thomas Reeve, the same compliance officer who had fled the state days after the investigation reopened in 2002. What chilled Mendoza wasn't just that Webb's name appeared, but that several other missing employees from nearby counties were also listed under subsequent dates. It suggested a phantom workforce operating wells that officially no longer existed. She printed the documents, placed them in a manila envelope, and drove to the courthouse basement where the Webb evidence box still sat beneath a layer of dust and disinterest. Inside the box lay the old cassette recorder, its batteries corroded, its label faded. Mendoza arranged to have it reanalyzed by the state's modern forensic lab in Austin. This time, technology could recover frequencies unheard in 2001. When the enhanced audio returned a week later, the new spectrogram revealed something buried beneath the radio static, another voice. Faint, low, speaking over Daniel's murmurs. It repeated a phrase every 27 seconds. Shift clear. Pressure stable. It was a voice command system, but none existed on field recorders 2 decades ago. The analyst noted that the modulation pattern matched two-way radio transmissions used by industrial dispatchers at the time. Someone had been speaking to Daniel from another location while he recorded his log. Mendoza drove out to the abandoned pump site 7B again for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The land was still barren, the air tasting faintly of sulfur and heat. The rusted machinery stood like a skeleton under the sun. She walked the perimeter, tracing the old tire ruts now fossilized in dry soil. Near the collapsed concrete vault, she found fragments of plastic tubing with a manufacturer's code that didn't exist before 2005. That meant someone had been back to the site years after Daniel disappeared. She collected samples, tagged GPS coordinates, and called in state environmental officers. Within 48 hours, the site was sealed as an active crime scene again. Sheriff Delaney, gray-haired and 1 year from retirement, authorized a limited dig. What they uncovered beneath the old pump wasn't oil equipment. It was a sealed steel drum with chemical warning labels worn nearly invisible by time. When technicians pried it open, the stench of petroleum and decay hit like a wave. Inside, wrapped in degraded plastic, were fragments of a work shirt embroidered with the Lone Star Petroleum logo, and human remains consistent with a single adult male. Dental records confirmed what Lubbock County had waited 18 years to hear. It was Daniel Webb. The official report listed cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with an industrial accident, but forensic markers told a darker story. There were ligature marks on the wrists, traces of adhesive tape around the mouth, and fractures inconsistent with a fall. Daniel Webb had been restrained before death. The coroner estimated time of death between 8:20 and 8:30 p.m. on October 27, 2001, the same window when his clock and radio froze. The discovery reignited the entire investigation. The old rumor of corporate sabotage transformed overnight into probable homicide. Mendoza's review of the recovered shift logs revealed a hidden code embedded within the maintenance entries. Each approved by TR corresponded to a well that had been secretly reactivated after official shutdown, pumping unreported crude into a separate network of underground tanks. The profits from those ghost wells were siphoned through shell companies registered in neighboring counties. It was $1 million operation hiding in plain sight, protected by falsified compliance reports and manipulated production data. The deeper Mendoza dug, the more she realized that Daniel Webb had stumbled onto the scheme in 2001 while reconciling pump pressure logs. His cassette recording, dismissed as rambling paranoia, was actually a live documentation of him confronting the system, recording evidence the conspirators couldn't afford to exist. The phrase, "It's already under the pump," now read like a desperate warning, not a riddle. Daniel had hidden physical proof of the fraud somewhere beneath the machinery before he was silenced. Lone Star Petroleum, now rebranded as HorizonTex Industries after multiple mergers, initially refused cooperation. Their lawyers cited corporate succession laws and lost archives. But when the Texas Attorney General's office received a subpoena request from Lubbock County, the company quietly handed over a hard drive labeled Legacy Environmental Audit, Restricted. On that drive were scanned payroll ledgers dating from 2000 to 2003, showing salary disbursements to names that didn't correspond to real employees. Among them were several variations of Daniel Webb's name used after his disappearance: Daniel Webb Jr., D. Webster, and W. Daniels, each linked to a bank account in Midland under a trust administered by none other than Thomas Reeve. For nearly 2 decades, Reeve had used the identities of missing oil workers to funnel unreported income through offshore accounts. The revelation hit the local news cycle like a thunderclap. Lubbock County residents who'd grown up hearing ghost stories about Daniel Webb were suddenly confronted with spreadsheets and wire transfers. The impossible disappearance had an all-too-human motive: greed. Still, one detail refused to align: the locked farmhouse. Even if Reeve or accomplices killed Webb at the field, how had they staged his home to appear sealed from within? Mendoza revisited every photograph from 2001, digitally enhanced them, and noticed something overlooked for years. The bolt on the back door was installed backwards. The catch plate faced outward, meaning it could be slid shut from outside using a thin metal rod. Daniel's obsession with home security had ironically made his house easy to fake lock once someone understood the flaw. Forensic recreation confirmed the possibility. Reeve could have accompanied Webb home under pretext of discussing the numbers not matching, subdued him, bolted the door from outside, and driven him back to the field. The eerie perfection of the scene had paralyzed investigators in 2001, but in hindsight it was engineering simplicity mistaken for supernatural impossibility. On June 18, 2019, the U.S. Marshals tracked Thomas Reeve to a small town in southern New Mexico where he'd been living under the alias Harold Lane, managing a trailer park. When confronted, Reeve initially denied everything, claiming he'd been framed by corporate rivals. But DNA recovered from the drum site matched hair found in his old company locker. Faced with the evidence, he requested an attorney and refused further questions. The trial that followed in 2020 became national news, the first major cold case conviction in Lubbock County history tied to corporate crime rather than domestic violence or serial murder. Prosecutors laid out a meticulous scheme: decommissioned wells illegally reactivated to skim production, forged safety reports, falsified night shift logs to maintain illusion of maintenance, And finally, the elimination of an honest technician who had noticed discrepancies. Jurors listened to Daniel Webb's restored cassette in silence, his final whispered pressure echoing through the courtroom. Reeve showed no emotion. On the third week of testimony, a surprise witness took the stand. Caleb Webb, Daniel's son, now an engineer working in Houston. He testified about finding an old file among his father's computer disks labeled Pump. Drift. The encrypted document contained coordinates corresponding to off-record well sites, proving Daniel had documented the scheme before confronting Reeve. That evidence sealed the verdict. Thomas Reeve was convicted of second-degree murder, conspiracy to defraud the state, and unlawful disposal of hazardous materials. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. For the town of Shallow Ridge, where Daniel had lived quietly for half a century, the conclusion brought more unease than relief. The myth of the vanishing man gave way to the reality of systemic corruption and betrayal by trusted authority. Mendoza attended the sentencing alone, sitting in the back row as the judge read the decision. When Reeve was led away, he turned once toward the gallery, his eyes unfocused, and said quietly to no one in particular. He knew the ground was breathing. The phrase was nonsense to most, but Mendoza recognized it from the enhanced recording, the same words Daniel had muttered before whispering, "pressure." It implied Reeve had been present when Daniel died. After the conviction, Mendoza revisited the pump site one last time. The excavation pit was filled and fenced, posted with environmental hazard warnings. She stood at sunset, listening to the wind through the grass, and for a moment thought she heard that same faint radio static from long ago. Later, when she reviewed her field recorder, the background captured a low vibration, not mechanical but rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat beneath the soil. The geotechnical team later confirmed that residual gas pockets under the decommissioned well still released intermittent pressure bursts. Yet part of Mendoza still wondered if Daniel's final word had been both literal and symbolic. Pressure from the earth, from conscience, from the weight of truth buried too long. The case closed officially in August 2019. Daniel Webb was reinterred beside his parents in Lubbock, Memorial Cemetery under a new headstone paid for by Lone Star Petroleum's successor as part of a civil settlement. It read simply, Daniel Webb, 1950-2001. He kept the pumps honest. For most residents, life moved on. But for those who remembered the farmhouse and the frozen clock, closure remained elusive. Sometimes at night, truckers driving past County Road 214 still reported seeing a porch light flicker on in the distance. Just once, around 8:21 p.m., as the radio from a forgotten era whispered through the static, counting down the seconds between truth and silence. By the time the verdict was handed down and the news trucks had packed up, the people of Shallow Ridge were desperate to put the story of Daniel Webb behind them. They told themselves justice had been served, the mystery solved, and that the locked farmhouse on County Road 214 was nothing more than an artifact of bad luck and corporate greed. But time in West Texas doesn't heal so much as flatten things out. Memories, landmarks, people. And in the months following the trial, a quieter, stranger chapter of the story began to unfold. One that no court transcript or news article would ever capture. Deputy Mendoza stayed with the sheriff's office after the conviction, but something in her changed. She began to drive out to the Webb farmhouse after shifts, parking on the dirt road just far enough away to see the porch light in her rearview mirror. The county had fenced off the property for safety, labeling it condemned, but locals still said you could see faint light leaking through the windows on certain nights when the wind came from the south. Mendoza told herself it was electrical reflection from oil rigs on the horizon. Still, she left her cruiser engine idling every time she stopped there, unable to shake the feeling that if she turned the key off, the silence might swallow her whole. Her fixation deepened when the Texas Department of Public Safety released its final analysis report on the cassette recovered from Daniel's buried drum. The enhanced file contained 8 minutes of low-frequency audio below the range of human speech, recorded before the final segment. Analysts classified it as subsurface resonance, possibly an equipment hum from nearby active pumps. But geologists at Texas Tech reviewed the data and noted something else. The sound wasn't random. It pulsed in intervals consistent with coded transmission. Roughly 4 beats, then a pause, repeated 12 times. One of the researchers overlaid the signal against seismic data from the region, and discovered it matched tremors recorded the same night Daniel disappeared, centered precisely under the 7B site. The quake was minor, imperceptible to residents, but its frequency mirrored Daniel's whispered cadence. When Mendoza read the report, she underlined one phrase: subsurface resonance consistent with human rhythmic pattern. She didn't know what it meant, but the phrasing clung to her mind like a splinter. 6 months after Reeves' conviction, HorizonTex Industries sold its remaining Lubbock leases to an out-of-state conglomerate. As part of the sale, environmental consultants surveyed every decommissioned well in the region. One team reported finding anomalous magnetic readings at a sealed cap near County Road 217, roughly 5 miles from the Webb farmhouse. The well, coded as Site 9C, had supposedly been closed in 1994. When Mendoza received the report, she immediately noticed the signature on the original closure paperwork: Thomas Reeve. She requested permission to accompany the survey crew during their next inspection. The site was nothing but a circular clearing surrounded by mesquite and dust, but when the consultant's magnetometer passed over the well cap, its needle jumped violently before stabilizing. Under the heavy steel lid, they found a second chamber, smaller than the one at 7B, filled not with machinery, but sealed crates of old microfilm reels, company production archives from 1999 to 2002. At first, the discovery seemed administrative, another batch of forgotten records. But the microfilm labels were handwritten, not printed, and every roll bore the same initialing pattern, DW and TR. The notation indicated dual verification, meaning Daniel Webb had co-signed these logs with Reeve during his final year of employment. That shouldn't have been possible, because according to Lone Star Petroleum's corporate hierarchy, Webb had no clearance to authorize production reports. Mendoza took several reels back to the station for examination. When digitized, the images revealed night shift charts annotated in Daniel's handwriting, showing pump pressure discrepancies between reported and actual output. On the final reel, dated October 27, 2001, an annotation ran across the margin in bold pencil: check depth anomaly, line 9C, possible seep. The entry suggested Daniel had detected abnormal pressure in the supposedly inactive 9C well hours before his disappearance. Mendoza ordered a new soil analysis at the site. The environmental lab reported traces of hydrocarbons inconsistent with crude oil, lighter, volatile, closer to aviation fuel. That chemical signature implied illegal dumping of refined product, not extraction. In simple terms, someone had been using the decommissioned well to bury hazardous waste under the guise of oil storage. The revelation reframed Daniel's discovery. It wasn't just stolen oil. It was industrial cover-up. If exposed, it could have cost HorizonTex millions in federal fines. When the news reached Austin, the Attorney General's office reopened the environmental portion of the case, subpoenaing HorizonTex's internal archives. Among the files was an encrypted email chain between Reeve and an unidentified regional director using the alias MH. The messages referenced pressure irregularities and containment protocols. At several sites including 7B and 9C, dated October 2001, the final message from Reeve read, Webb found the seep. We'll handle before shift logs circulate. The timestamp was 8:14 p.m., 7 minutes before Daniel's clock stopped. The alias MH proved maddeningly generic. Corporate personnel records listed 3 employees with those initials, 2 deceased, 1 retired. That last one, Matthew Harlan, had served as operations director for the Midland Division before moving to Florida in 2003. When federal investigators finally tracked him down in Sarasota, he was 72 years old and suffering from advanced Parkinson's disease. His deposition, recorded under oath, lasted only 20 minutes. Asked about the emails, he claimed no recollection, but confirmed Reeve had reported a containment breach the night Webb disappeared. When pressed on what containment referred to, Harlan's answer was barely audible: not oil. Something from the old contracts. We were told to bury it deep. He refused to elaborate further. The statement triggered panic at HorizonTex headquarters. Within days, company lawyers issued gag orders to former employees and moved to seal certain environmental records under federal trade secrecy provisions. But the leaks had already begun. A freelance journalist named Olivia Grant, who'd been covering the Webb case since the trial, received a packet of documents from an anonymous source. Inside were photographs taken during the 2002 excavation at 7B, images never released publicly. They showed not one but 3 steel drums in the pit. Only one had been opened and identified as Daniel Webb's makeshift coffin. The other 2 had been quietly removed before sunrise and cataloged simply as hazmat material, transferred. Grant published the photos online, sparking renewed outrage. The state ordered HorizonTex to disclose where those drums had gone. The company claimed they'd been transported to a disposal facility near Odessa, but inspection records at that facility showed no such delivery. The other 2 drums had vanished. For Mendoza, the revelation reopened every wound the conviction had barely closed. If there were additional drums, what was in them? Why had the second chamber at 9C been sealed with microfilm and not waste? She returned to the site with ground-penetrating radar. Beneath the layer of concrete, she found another cavity, smaller, lined with corrugated steel. Inside was a rusted metal locker stamped with the initials LSP and a tag reading Shift Supervisor 2001. The contents were skeletal fragments of small animals, likely testing specimens, and half-melted vials with chemical residue. Lab analysis later confirmed traces of methylethyl ketone peroxide, a highly unstable industrial solvent used for resin hardening. Its presence in soil explained the anomalous hydrocarbons the lab had flagged. The official explanation HorizonTex offered was simple negligence, obsolete chemicals buried decades ago. But Mendoza noticed a pattern. Every contamination site corresponded with wells logged as inactive by Reeve and Harlan. Every disappearance on record from that same era, 3 oil field workers across 2 counties, had connections to those sites. It suggested a systematic effort to dispose of hazardous waste using human cover stories to mask irregular shipments. Daniel Webb had merely been the last man to see too much. In 2021, a federal grand jury indicted HorizonTex Energy on 27 counts of environmental fraud and obstruction. The corporation paid fines but admitted no wrongdoing. Most of the executives named in the case had already retired. The community of Shallow Ridge gained notoriety again, its name printed beside words like toxic dumping scandal and corporate homicide. Residents who had once spoken Daniel's name with reverence now did so with exhaustion. The farmhouse was finally demolished after a grass fire swept through the area that summer. Nothing remained but a concrete foundation and the metal frame of the radio antenna half buried in dirt. The following spring, as the county prepared to dedicate a memorial plaque to Daniel Webb, Deputy Mendoza received a small package with no return address. Inside was a cassette labeled Backup DW1026. It was identical to the original recorder's make and model. When she played it in the evidence room, the tape began with familiar static. Then Daniel's voice. Test 2, night before shift. Meter still fluctuating. If this doesn't record right, I'll bring it to Carla tomorrow. It was the first time she'd heard her own name in his voice. She froze, realizing the recording had been made less than 24 hours before he vanished. Then, faintly, another voice entered, the same deep tone later identified as Reeve. He said, "Stop digging, Dan. You don't know what's under there." Daniel replied, "I know enough. It's not oil." A clatter followed, the sound of boots on gravel, and then a hiss like air escaping a pipe. The tape ended in silence. Mendoza sat alone long after the playback stopped. The cassette contained proof of premeditation, but the statute of limitations on accessory charges had expired for everyone but the corporation itself. Still, she couldn't shake Daniel's final certainty. It's not oil. That phrase, more than pressure or under the pump, felt like the truest message he left behind. By 2023, the Webb case became required reading for state law enforcement trainees as an example of procedural persistence. The official narrative ended with corporate conviction and environmental cleanup, but for those who lived near County Road 214, the story persisted differently. They said after midnight, when the wind shifted east and the planes went still, you could hear a faint hum beneath the ground, steady, mechanical, but too rhythmic to be machinery. Some claimed it was the residual pressure of buried drums venting gases. Others said it was Daniel Webb's last message still echoing through the soil, a warning from a man who tried to tell the truth before the earth itself was forced to keep his secret. Deputy Mendoza, nearing retirement, kept the second cassette locked in her desk. Sometimes she played it through noise-canceling headphones, just to hear the beginning. The small sound of Daniel clearing his throat before speaking. In those brief seconds before mystery and murder and scandal swallowed his name, he was just a man doing his job, talking into a machine, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up. She liked to think that somewhere in that static between the wind and the hum, there was still a fragment of his voice that the desert hadn't managed to erase. By autumn of 2024, 3 years after the final EPA cleanup at the old 7B and 9C well sites, Lubbock County's landscape looked ordinary again. The fences were down, the warning signs faded, and tumbleweeds rolled over ground that had once hidden the most expensive environmental scandal in Texas history. To passing truckers, there was nothing remarkable about the patch of earth where Daniel Webb had died. No markers, no plaque, not even the faint smell of oil anymore. But for those who'd followed the case, that emptiness felt heavier than memory, as though the land itself refused to forgive what had been done beneath it. The sheriff's department closed the file permanently in early November, labeling it resolved, homicide with conviction. Yet in her office, senior investigator Carla Mendoza refused to transfer the evidence boxes to the archives. She'd been scheduled to retire at the end of the year, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Every time she handled the tapes or the microfilm reels, she found some new inconsistency, some small, unanswered question that made the case feel unfinished. The one that kept her awake most nights involved the anonymous package that had contained Daniel's backup DW-1026 cassette. The package had been postmarked from Odessa, but the sender's address was smudged beyond legibility. When she checked with the Postal Service, they confirmed the handwriting matched another shipment from 3 years earlier, an evidence parcel mailed to state investigators containing the original microfilm reels from Site 9C. That shipment, too, had no verifiable sender. It was as though someone inside the HorizonTex network, someone who'd never been caught or named, had been quietly leaking evidence all along, guiding the investigation from the shadows. Mendoza kept that theory to herself. Officially, the case was over, and any suggestion of an unindicted accomplice threatened to reopen the corporate settlement. But privately, she began to suspect that MH, the mysterious initials in Reeves' email thread, hadn't belonged to Matthew Harlan at all. Her suspicion deepened when she received a call from a retired geologist named Alan Hurst, who'd been contracted by Lone Star Petroleum in 2001 to perform soil density testing near the decommissioned sites. Hurst had followed the trial and said he'd always felt something was missing from the public story. In his old notebooks, he'd found test data from the week before Daniel disappeared. One entry recorded seismic readings around the 9C site showing unnatural resonance pockets between 60 and 80 feet deep, essentially hollow cavities that shouldn't have existed in natural shale. He'd filed the report to the Midland office and received a reply signed by MH, instructing him to delete the raw data and destroy the instrument logs. Hurst hadn't deleted anything. He'd simply boxed the data tapes and stored them in his garage for 23 years. Now, listening to the faint tremor still present in his memory, he wondered if those voids were where the missing drums had been buried. Mendoza drove to his ranch the next day. The tapes were old reel-to-reel seismic records, their labels faded but intact. She arranged for a university lab to digitize them. The results showed 3 distinct subterranean voids aligned in a perfect triangle, each approximately 65 feet below the surface, roughly corresponding to the 7B, 9C, and 12D sites, all wells associated with Thomas Reeves' maintenance zone. But what startled analysts wasn't their geometry. It was the acoustic feedback signature inside those voids. It matched the low-frequency pulse from Daniel Webb's final recording, the same 4-beat pattern. When amplified, it produced a faint modulation that almost resembled human speech, indistinct, repetitive, rhythmic. One technician, unnerved, described it as a voice breathing through rock. Mendoza tried to rationalize it. Subsurface resonance, microfracture gas releases, interference from nearby pipelines, anything but what it sounded like. Still, she sent the audio to the Texas Geological Institute, requesting independent analysis. Their report, delivered 3 weeks later, offered a more technical but equally disturbing conclusion. Patterned acoustic emissions suggest mechanical oscillation source operating periodically within sealed geological cavities. No known equipment or natural process matches this profile at the recorded depths. In simpler terms, something was still moving under the sealed wells, even though all machinery had been removed decades ago. That December, a freak storm swept across West Texas, flooding dry gullies and exposing long-buried debris. A rancher riding along County Road 218 discovered a chunk of corroded metal protruding from a washout near the 12D site. When investigators dug it out, they found the lid of a steel drum identical to those from 7B. Same dimensions, same faded hazard symbols. Inside were 2 sets of skeletal remains, 1 adult male, 1 female, both showing signs of chemical exposure and blunt trauma. Dental records later identified them as former HorizonTex employees missing since 2000, foreman Dale Riggins and administrative clerk Maria Holt. The initials MH on Reeves' old emails suddenly had a new, sinister possibility. Maria Holt had supervised shift reporting before she vanished. The discovery detonated through every level of state government. What had been a solved murder suddenly mutated into a broader conspiracy encompassing at least 3 victims. The Department of Justice reopened the file as a serial homicide investigation tied to corporate environmental crimes. Mendoza was called out of retirement to consult. It was both validation and curse. The more evidence she helped uncover, the more she realized how deeply Daniel Webb's death had been entangled in a system of calculated erasures. Federal archivists uncovered additional payroll records showing that Maria Holt and Dale Riggins had signed off on maintenance discrepancies similar to Daniel's. The last entries under Holt's name, dated August 2000, were countersigned TR, Thomas Reeve. The last under Riggins, from December 2000 bore DW. The implication was chilling. Daniel had been unknowingly approving logs tied to 2 colleagues who were already dead. That meant whoever had manipulated the records wanted to create a paper trail that made him complicit, ensuring that if the fraud was discovered, suspicion would fall on the man who was now a corpse in a drum. In March 2025, Mendoza returned once again to the field where 7B had stood. The state had fenced it off permanently, filling the excavation with cement, but she brought ground-penetrating radar anyway. On the perimeter beyond the sealed cap, she picked up faint metallic reflections. The excavation that followed revealed something unexpected. A steel maintenance box embedded in the soil, its hinges fused shut with rust. Inside, preserved against decades of heat and dust, lay a stack of laminated maps, each marked with pressure readings and cryptic notes in Daniel Webb's handwriting. The final map, dated October 27, 2001, showed a hand-drawn circle connecting 7B, 9C, and 12D, annotated with a single sentence. 3 sites, 1 system, breathing line. To geologists, breathing line was an old term for an underground ventilation shaft used to equalize pressure between wells. If Daniel's map was accurate, those decommissioned sites weren't independent. They were connected through buried tunnels built during the oil boom of the 1950s, later repurposed by Reeve and his partners for waste storage. When those shafts collapsed, they created the resonance frequencies that Daniel had recorded as the ground breathing. He had literally uncovered the hidden veins of a corporate crime, and it had cost him his life. The government ordered core drilling to confirm the tunnel's existence. The boring operation lasted 2 weeks before workers hit an unexpected cavity filled with viscous black fluid that smelled faintly of fuel and rot. Instruments lowered into the void recorded faint heat signatures, temperature fluctuations that pulsed in intervals matching the old seismic data. When one probe malfunctioned, engineers pulled it up to find its sensors coated with a gelatinous residue rich in hydrocarbon compounds and organic protein. Lab tests couldn't determine its source. Not petroleum, the report concluded. Possible bacterial or fungal biomass. The finding reignited rumors that something unnatural lived beneath the plains, feeding on decades of waste. Conspiracy sites claimed the breathing wells had created microbial colonies capable of generating pressure rhythms mistaken for voices. Scientists dismissed it as pseudoscience, but Mendoza couldn't forget the pattern's human cadence. Late one night, she replayed Daniel's final tape again. When she slowed it to half speed, the faint background hum resolved into syllables, distorted but unmistakable. Down here. She told no one. By summer, construction crews began sealing the remaining decommissioned wells with concrete slurry, erasing physical traces of the tunnels. On her last day with the department, Mendoza drove back to County Road 214, parking where the Webb farmhouse once stood. The foundation was cracked and half-buried, the radio antenna twisted like a broken rib. The sky was the same washed-out blue it had been the night Daniel vanished. She turned off the engine and sat listening, For a long time, there was nothing but wind. Then, faintly from somewhere below the earth, came that slow, pulsing rhythm, 4 beats and a pause over and over. She couldn't tell if it was memory or machinery or the echo of something older, still moving beneath the shale. When she left, she didn't look back. That night, a maintenance worker at the new HorizonTex drilling site 30 miles north reported a strange radio interference around 8:21 p.m. A burst of static carrying a man's voice saying, "Pressure stable." The signal lasted 12 seconds before vanishing from the band. Engineers traced it to no source. They chalked it up to atmospheric anomaly. But in the official logbook for that night, the worker who reported the incident, a quiet young technician named Luke Webb, Daniel's grandson, wrote one extra line beneath the timestamp, heard the voice. "Same as Grandpa's." The entry was dismissed by supervisors, filed away with hundreds of routine notes. But years later, when the radio frequency was scanned again, that same pattern would return, steady, human, and impossibly familiar, whispering through the static of the West Texas night, keeping count of time on a land that never forgot what lay buried beneath it. The year 2026 began with silence, the kind that felt engineered, an intentional quiet that followed every scandal too large to explain. HorizonTex had dissolved entirely, absorbed by an international conglomerate called Petrodyne Global. Legal settlements were finalized, state archives sealed, and Daniel Webb's name receded once more into rumor. For the public, the Texas 2001 cold case had finally become history, a cautionary tale of corruption and greed wrapped neatly in a courtroom narrative. But for those who had lived through it, the few who had touched the evidence, breathed that chemical dust, or stood in those fields, the story refused to die. It lingered like an old radio frequency that no one had fully tuned out. By spring, strange reports began filtering through the oil fields again. Workers claimed to hear mechanical pulses underground that didn't match pump timing. Others described static bursts through their headsets during night shifts, short, rhythmic beats that sometimes carried faint whispers. The official explanation was electromagnetic interference from the new Petrodyne transmission grid. But a handful of older workers, men who had known Daniel Webb personally, swore it was the same pattern, the 4 beats and pause that had haunted Lubbock County since 2001. When those stories reached retired Deputy Carla Mendoza, she told herself she wouldn't get involved. She had spent half her career chasing ghosts through paperwork, losing friends and sleep to a mystery that had already consumed too much. But obsession doesn't retire. It just changes shape. She began clipping every mention of the new disturbances, mapping the coordinates like she once mapped the cold case leads. Over 3 months, she realized the reports formed a near-perfect triangle centered on the former 7B site. The breathing line Daniel had drawn 25 years earlier was active again. In June, a young field geologist named Ryan Corbett contacted her through an encrypted email. He said he'd been contracted by Petrodyne to analyze subsurface resonance patterns for safety compliance. He'd run acoustic sweeps under several decommissioned wells and found synchronized low-frequency vibrations that couldn't be explained by machinery. When he cross-referenced the data with public geological maps, he found that the vibrations aligned with the old HorizonTex tunnels sealed after the investigation. He attached a spectrogram image to the email, a series of waves repeating in exact intervals. Beneath it, he wrote, "This isn't seismic activity. It's signal repetition. Someone, or something, is still transmitting." Mendoza met Corbett in person at a diner outside Shallow Ridge. He was in his late 20s, pale from fieldwork, his hands trembling slightly when he slid a USB drive across the table. "It's not just interference," he said. "There's structure to the sound. Harmonics, patterns, even modulation, like someone trying to talk through rock." She asked if he'd played the recording backward, slowed it down, filtered frequencies. He nodded, eyes wide. "That's the thing. It doesn't matter how you filter it. The rhythm adjusts, like it's reacting." He smiled nervously. "I stopped running the analysis after the waveform started matching my own heartbeat." Mendoza took the drive home and listened to the recordings on her old laptop, the same one she'd used during the Webb case. The first clip was nothing but static. The second, deeper, contained the familiar pulse. 4 beats, pause, repeat. But there was something new beneath it, an echoing tone that rose and fell in pitch. She slowed the audio to 1/4 speed. The tone formed 3 syllables, unintelligible but deliberate. When she looped it, her heart stuttered as she realized what it resembled. Relay. The next morning, she drove straight to the county archive to check the original seismic reels from 2001. When she played them side by side with Corbett's new data, the frequency alignment was nearly identical. Same origin depth, same resonance window, same pulse duration. 2.5 decades apart, but the same source. The simplest explanation was a leak of trapped gas in sealed strata. The harder truth, the one her mind resisted, was that Daniel Webb's final message had never stopped transmitting. It had been waiting, repeating itself beneath Texas clay, until someone tuned in again. Meanwhile, Petrodyne Global announced plans to construct a new carbon capture facility near the old 7B site, promising hundreds of local jobs. The county commissioners approved the permit without hesitation, citing economic recovery. Environmental review documents showed the company had quietly drilled exploratory vents into the shale layers, exactly the same depth as the tunnels that once held the drums. When Mendoza read the report, her stomach turned. She called the engineering office, posing as a journalist, and asked about seismic safety. The representative assured her the site was stable and all prior anomalies had been neutralized during remediation, but his voice faltered when she asked if any recordings had been made during the test drilling. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I'm not supposed to talk about the noise." She drove out that night. The roads were empty, the horizon glowing faintly orange from distant gas flares. The new facility stood half-built, a lattice of cranes and tanks silhouetted against a flat sky. Security fencing surrounded the site, but Mendoza parked beyond the ridge and walked in through a gap where a section of chain link had been cut. The wind carried the faint smell of ozone and wet clay. At the center of the lot, a cylindrical vent pipe rose from the ground, new steel welded onto old concrete. A faint hum emanated from within. She placed her hand over the vent opening. The vibration was warm, rhythmic, pulsing 4 times before a pause. She whispered, "Daniel?" And for a second, the vibration stopped. Then the hum returned, faster this time, almost frantic. She stumbled back, her pulse racing, the echo of that sound still thudding through her ribs. The next morning, Petrodyne sealed off the site without explanation. Local papers reported minor geological instability. Workers were reassigned. Corbett, the young geologist, vanished a week later. His car was found abandoned on Highway 84, door open, engine running, laptop missing. His last GPS ping placed him less than a mile from County Road 214, the former Webb farmhouse location. The FBI briefly reopened inquiry into possible corporate retaliation, but without evidence, the case dissolved. Mendoza tried to access Corbett's original seismic data, only to find his cloud account deleted and the USB drive corrupted. When forensic techs attempted recovery, the only readable file name was underthepump.wav. Its metadata timestamp read 8:21 p.m. Unable to prove foul play, Mendoza turned to her own investigation. She visited the Texas Geological Institute again, showing them the last spectrogram image Corbett had emailed. One of the senior researchers, Dr. Aditi Rao, compared it with deep earth pressure cycles recorded across the Permian Basin. She frowned. "This frequency isn't mechanical. It's rhythmic modulation like feedback from a power grid, but too deep. If these readings are real, something down there is oscillating energy. Maybe gas compression, maybe something else. Whatever it is, it's not done moving." By late summer, unconfirmed reports circulated among local rig workers of spontaneous ground tremors around the sealed sites. Small, localized, never lasting more than 10 seconds, but always occurring near 8:21 p.m. Some swore they saw faint light bleeding up through cracks in the soil. Bluish-white, like lightning trapped underground. Videos posted online were blurry, inconclusive, dismissed as hoaxes. But Mendoza recognized the hum in their background audio. She knew that rhythm. One evening she returned to the ruins of the farmhouse, now little more than broken concrete and rusted nails. The sky was heavy with heat, the air electric before a storm. She sat in her truck as lightning flickered far to the north. At 8:19 she turned off the engine. The wind died. At 8:20 she felt it, a low tremor rolling beneath the earth like breath. And at 8:21 the radio on her dashboard flicked on by itself, tuning to static. Through the hiss came a man's voice, calm, familiar. "Pressure's stable, Carla. Don't dig." Then silence. The radio stayed dead after that. She drove home shaking, unable to explain what she'd heard. Later, she told herself it was memory, coincidence, grief shaped by static. But deep down, she knew the truth Daniel Webb had died for, that the ground in West Texas had never stopped breathing. When Petrodin completed construction in 2027, they sealed the carbon vaults with reinforced concrete, pouring millions of tons of slurry into the old shafts. The operation was hailed as a technological triumph, the future of clean energy storage. On the day of the ribbon cutting, the company president declared, "We've buried the past to protect the future." That night, every monitoring sensor across the facility failed simultaneously for 12 minutes. The engineers called it a data glitch caused by solar interference. But when the system came back online, every pressure gauge read exactly the same number, 8.21. And beneath that plateau of silence, the instruments captured one last burst of low-frequency sound before cutting out entirely. 4 steady pulses. A pause, and then a voice faint enough to slip between the noise. Still here. The data log ended there. No one at Petrodin ever mentioned it publicly, but Mendoza kept a printed copy locked in her file cabinet, alongside Daniel Webb's tapes, his maps, and the photo of the farmhouse frozen in moonlight. She never tried to explain the number again. Some truths, she decided, were meant to stay buried, alive but silent, like pressure under shale, waiting for the next shift in the earth to let them speak once more. By early 2028, West Texas had returned to its deceptive calm, a landscape that looked the same as it always had, long horizons, windmills, dust storms, the steady heartbeat of pump jacks moving against the dusk. But beneath that familiar rhythm, the land was changing in ways no one could quite explain. Seismic monitors across Grady and Lubbock counties began recording microtremors, tiny, synchronized pulses occurring at precisely 8:21 p.m. each night. The readings were too uniform to be natural and too weak to trigger alarms. State geologists blamed it on thermal expansion of subsurface infrastructure, but the pattern spread, first to Midland, then to San Angelo, then north into the Panhandle, as if whatever had started under County Road 214 was slowly exhaling across the basin. Petrodin Global's engineers noticed it first. Their digital pressure logs, calibrated to detect microseepage in carbon capture chambers, began returning anomalous readings. The chambers were supposed to be sealed. Instead, they behaved like lungs, drawing in trace gases during the heat of the day, exhaling pressure just after sunset. The phenomenon baffled the physics models. Then, in late March, a maintenance drone lowered into Vault B7 recorded something impossible. A faint echo, low and rhythmic, resonating from deeper strata below the concrete base. The drone's audio sensors captured exactly 4 beats, followed by a pause. Engineers dismissed it as a feedback loop until the machine transmitted one last line of diagnostic code before losing connection. Audio match. 7B Well Archive 2003 DAT. When that report reached retired investigator Carla Mendoza, still living alone outside Millbrook, her walls lined with evidence boxes she couldn't let go of, she knew instantly what it meant. The digital signature matched Daniel Webb's original field recording. She hadn't listened to it in years, but she remembered the pulse the way one remembers a recurring nightmare. 4 beats, 1 pause, infinite repetition. She stared at the timestamp, 8:21 p.m., March 29, 2028, and felt a cold certainty settle over her. Whatever they had buried had not gone dormant. That night, Mendoza drove out to the old 7B site, ignoring the no trespassing signs Petrodin had erected after the carbon vaults were sealed. The road was rough, eaten by dust and neglect, the same stretch where she had once found Daniel's recorder half frozen in mud. She parked by the chain-link fence, stepped out into the wind, and waited. The sky was a sheet of iron clouds. Thunder rolled far away, muted and patient. At 8:20, the ground began to tremble, not violently, just a subtle vibration like a heart restarting after too long a silence. At 8:21, her phone buzzed. "Unknown number," she answered without thinking. Static filled the line, soft and wet like rain against glass. Then a voice, male, tired, familiar. "Pressure's fine, Carla. Don't let them open it again." The call ended. She stared at the dead phone, the number already erased from the log. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of ozone and iron. Somewhere beneath her feet, the earth breathed once and went still. In April, Petrodin's Midland Control Center detected a sudden rise in internal chamber temperature across the carbon vaults. For 12 minutes, all vaults registered identical readings, 82.1 degree, then flatlined. Monitoring equipment failed simultaneously across 4 counties. When systems rebooted, every pressure gauge showed 0 differential, as if the underground network had equalized itself. The company's public statement cited software synchronization errors, but internal memos leaked weeks later revealed panic. Engineers found microfractures in the concrete seals, long, narrow fissures radiating outward in precise compass directions, forming what one analyst described as a geometric respiration grid. The fractures matched the exact configuration of Daniel Webb's hand-drawn map from 2001, 7B, and C, 12D, 3 points forming a triangle. Federal inspectors arrived in May. They drilled test cores to verify structural stability and found something entirely new, a thin film of organic residue coating the inner layers of the sealant. The substance fluoresced under UV light and pulsed faintly when exposed to oxygen. Its chemical composition defied categorization, part hydrocarbon, part protein, part unknown polymer chain. The lab reports concluded, material appears biologically active though non-cellular. Displays responsive vibration to acoustic frequency between 0.8 to 2.1 Hz. In other words, it moved when sound reached it. When the findings leaked, Petrodyn issued a gag order, halting all drilling and quietly evacuating staff from the affected zones. Publicly, they blamed ventilation anomalies. Privately, the board debated whether to reseal the entire basin with reinforced glass fiber concrete, an operation that would cost billions. But time was already running out. In June, tremors began registering as far east as Abilene. Amateur radio enthusiasts reported bursts of low-frequency noise sweeping through the 7.9 MHz band, identical to Daniel Webb's last recording. The noise carried fragments of human speech buried in static. Some operators swore they heard phrases, pressure, below, stable, though no 2 accounts matched. On June 18th, a night shift operator named Michael Torres at Petrodin's Shallow Ridge facility experienced what would later be called the breath event. At exactly 8:21 p.m., all floor lights flickered. His headset filled with heavy static, followed by a drawn-out sigh that lasted nearly 30 seconds. He described it as the ground exhaling. Then came the voice, low, layered, almost harmonic. Still here. The sound wave hit a resonant frequency that shattered 2 observation windows. Torres fled the control room. Within minutes, seismic monitors across the county registered a synchronized pulse emanating from beneath the carbon vaults. 4 beats, 1 pause, repeating 12 times before fading. Afterward, every pressure reading returned to normal. The event went unreported for months, buried under non-disclosure agreements. But Mendoza heard about it through an old contact at the Department of Natural Resources. The data logs were identical to those recorded the night Daniel Webb disappeared. She printed them out, laid them over the 2001 seismic charts, and the lines matched perfectly. Different machines, same pattern, 27 years apart. Whatever Daniel had uncovered, the tunnels, the breathing line, the residue, they were all part of one continuous system. And now that system was awake. In August, she traveled to Austin to meet Dr. Aditi Rao, the geophysicist who had once helped analyze the Webb recordings. Rao looked exhausted, her office cluttered with unread reports and sleepless coffee cups. "They won't say it publicly," she whispered, "but the material they found in the vault seals, it's metabolizing carbon dioxide. Actively. We're watching it feed." Mendoza frowned. "Feed on what?" Rao hesitated. "On us. On what we buried down there for decades." She tapped her screen, showing a magnified image of the residue under electron scan. The filaments looked disturbingly organized, branching networks resembling neural tissue. "It's not life as we define it," Rao said, "but it responds to sound and heat like something that remembers." In late September, satellite imagery captured faint heat plumes rising from the sealed Petrodyn vaults. The plumes formed symmetrical spirals visible only in infrared, each centered on the old HorizonTex coordinates. The phenomenon lasted 13 minutes, all between 8:21 and 8:34 p.m. When cross-referenced with local weather data, the plumes corresponded with microbursts of wind, sudden and synchronized, as if the Earth was literally exhaling pressure. Locals started calling it the breathing hour. Mendoza, unable to stay away, drove back once more to County Road 214. Nothing remained of the Webb farmhouse except wild grass and a single corner of cracked foundation. She brought a portable radio tuned to the old maintenance frequency Daniel used. At 8:20, static filled the air. At 8:21, the signal surged. Through the hiss came layered voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping in whispers. Pressure's fine. Stay above. Then silence. The ground vibrated once beneath her boots. She looked toward the horizon where distant oil fires shimmered like stars and realized the land was breathing again, not with menace, but with memory. The crimes, the lies, the waste, they had all been absorbed, metabolized, transformed into something that refused to vanish. Daniel had tried to warn them. The ground remembers. The earth keeps score. Weeks later, a federal task force announced plans to relocate residents near the basin, citing environmental instability. But relocation came too late. On October 14th, every seismograph in Texas registered a simultaneous low-frequency pulse that lasted precisely 47 seconds, the same length of time Sarah Chen had vanished into a Michigan blizzard, 2,000 miles away, in another story of locked doors and impossible disappearances. For a moment, data streams from across the country aligned into a single waveform. 4 beats, 1 pause, repeating. Then the signal dissipated into silence. When reporters asked Mendoza what it meant, she said only, "Some voices don't fade. They sink." By December 2028, the Petrodine Basin was sealed permanently, declared an exclusion zone by the state. Satellite images showed only cracked earth and empty roads. But on cloudless nights, radio operators from as far as Oklahoma still caught faint transmissions bleeding through static at 8:21 p.m. The same pulse, the same whisper, the same name carried on the wind. And somewhere, beneath hundreds of feet of sealed concrete and fossilized guilt, the land still breathed. Steady, patient, unrelenting, keeping its rhythm until someone, someday, would listen again.